Can a simple curve change everything for a 7-time world champion? What is behind the enigmatic classification of Lewis Hamilton in Silverstone that almost no one has noticed? Silverstone, the circuit where Lewis Hamilton has built much of his legacy, offered an unbeatable scenario so that the 7-time world champion demonstrated what he is capable of in his new stage with Ferrari. And for a good part of Saturday, that story seemed to be taking shape. On a track that knows pomo to pomo, Hamilton achieved a brilliant performance in Q2, placing himself at the head of the timetable, even the McLaren and Max Verstappen himself. It was a flash of genius that aroused a murmur of expectation not only in Ferrari's boxes, but in all the British fans. Silverstone roars the real possibility of seeing Hamilton in the pole wearing red for the first time. However, what happened moments later would change the script completely. In the Q3, when all the contestants went on track to give their last fastback attempt, Hamilton began with a first solid, very competitive sector, and that placed it within the fight for the front row. But everything collapsed in the last sector, specifically in the succession of Vale and Club curves. It was there that, according to the pilot himself, a sudden subviring caused him to lose more than a tenth, a fraction of a second that, in Formula One, separates the glory from resignation. That car's behavior was no accident, nor a punctual failure. It is a structural feature of the SF-25, a car that, although it has progressed, still turns well in slow curves. The frustration soon arrived. Hamilton knew that he had touched an extraordinary return, but it was the car that betrayed him at the most delicate point. And that final image, that of Hamilton crossing the goal without being able to improve enough to ensure a better position, contrasts brutally with the energy that had generated its leadership in Q2. To be in everyone's focus, he went on to occupy a fifth since he does not do justice to his real performance or the potential that the Ferrari showed in key sections of the classification. And yet, that final curve and that small slip hide a deeper truth. Hamilton is close, and the union with the SF-25 begins to take shape. What we saw in Silverstone was not a disappointing result, but a clear symptom that Ferrari, with Hamilton in command, can already be measured from you to you with the best. But the way to victory still depends on eliminating weaknesses such as that fateful lack of turn in low speeds. The difference between a fifth place and a pole was in a single curve. And that changes everything. The fifth position of Hamilton in the classification of the Grand Prix of Great Britain might seem, at first glance, a discrete result. But under that position, a much more revealing technical message is hidden, which begins to shape a much more interesting narrative about the present and future of Ferrari in 2025. To understand it, you have to look beyond the final time of 1:25.095 and the cold record of being just over 2/10 of the pole. You have to immerse yourself in the technical evolution of the car and in the specific circumstances of that weekend. Lewis Hamilton's performance in the classification of the Great Britain Grand Prix cannot be understood only since the coldness of the times. The truly relevant is in the trend that marks its fast return, in the general behavior of the SF-25 and in the technical improvements introduced in recent weeks by Ferrari. Because this result, although it did not give it a place in the first row, is much more than a statistical data. It is a clear sign that Ferrari begins to find direction in the midst of a reconstruction process that is still far from completing. The basis of this advance lies in a key piece that debuted in Austria, the new floor. This evolution of the flat bottom of the car was conceived to improve aerodynamic load in high-speed areas and reduce the rebound phenomenon that had tormented Ferrari in circuits with fast curves and irregular surfaces. Since its installation, the car has shown greater stability in medium and high-speed curves, allowing pilots to attack with more confidence and extract times consisting of sectors where they were previously forced to sacrifice performance. This explains why both Hamilton and Leclerc were in the top 3 of free training in Silverstone. The correlation between simulations and track began to consolidate, indicating that the data of the wind tunnel and the CFD are finally aligning with reality. This, in Formula One, is an unequivocal sign that the concept of the car is maturing. We are no longer talking about an SF-25 lost in the technical limbo, but about a car that begins to have identity. However, performance is still inconsistent in certain aspects, especially in slow curves. The loss of performance in low-speed sections remains the Achilles heel of this car. And that was evidenced with rawness in the Vale Club curve, where Hamilton lost key time due to sudden subverming. This behavior, far from being random, responds to a structural problem of the car. The geometry of the current rear suspension does not allow SF-25 to generate the necessary rotation in closed sections. The car tends to sink in the rear during the acceleration, which compromises the traction and leaves the front train without enough grip to turn effectively. Ferrari has been working for months in a new rear suspension configuration designed to eliminate this phenomenon known as Pro Squat and expand the car operating window in aerodynamic terms. However, that update has not yet arrived. His delay is conditioning not only the performance, but also the confidence of the pilots, who must adapt their driving style to compensate for a deficiency that should have been corrected in this phase of the championship. The paradoxical thing is that, despite this limitation, Hamilton managed to stay just 2/10 of the pole. And that says much more of its talent and its adaptation to the car than of the real state of the SF-25. The British has begun to adjust his pilot style, seeking to imitate certain characteristics of the Leclerc approach, especially in braking and load transition. This adaptation process, which did not complete in Mercedes in its last years, is happening in record time in Ferrari, which reveals both its commitment and the will of the team to make fine adjustments to maximize the potential available. In short, this 5th place does not represent a roof but a floor, a base on which Ferrari can build if he solves its background problems. Hamilton's performance in Silverstone suggests that, with the right tools, it may be ready to fight on equal terms. But for that to happen, it is imperative that the next updates arrive on time. Because in such a tight championship, every 10th account, and every curve, as demonstrated, can be the threshold between history and frustration. The result was a limit situation. Hamilton finished his initial return without serious errors, but when he returned to boxes, there was no more fuel. I couldn't go out again. And what seemed like a solid lap quickly became an agonizing classification. As other pilots improved their times, Hamilton descended positions. If it is in the provisional top 5, the elimination went on to border. Finally, the cut passed by just 121 thousandths. It was a relief, yes, but also a blow of reality. If one of the best pilots in history is at the mercy of strategic decisions so risky, the margin of error becomes a constant threat. This incident lit the alarms, not only among fans and analysts, but also within the environment of Formula One. In a sport where details make difference, criticism soon appeared. How can a team that aspires to overcome Red Bull and McLaren to assume unnecessary risks in such a critical session? Why does Ferrari still not consolidate a tactical structure that consistently supports its pilots? The result of Lewis Hamilton in the classification of the Great Prize of Great Britain, far from being an irrelevant or simply correct outcome, has deep implications for the immediate future of Ferrari. The 5th place, achieved in a technical context still incomplete, represents a turning point. It is a clear indicator that, with the right tools, Ferrari is beginning to approach a real competitiveness zone. But it also acts as a warning signal. The margin of improvement is still broad, and not reaching it in time can convert a promising project into another wasted cycle. But the most significant is what this result anticipates. If Ferrari manages to introduce, in the coming weeks, the revised rear suspension that has been in development for months that promises to expand the car operating window and correct the sinking under traction, the SF-25 can become a direct contender for the poles and the victories. The car already shows competitiveness in medium and high speed thanks to the new soil. If your behavior in slow curves is resolved, the time deficit in critical sectors such as Silverstone's 3rd can be reduced or even disappear. In such a tight championship, that completely changes the competitive map. In addition, this classification represents a key step in the integration of Hamilton into the Ferrari technical ecosystem. Not only for its pure performance but for how it has begun to influence the evolution of the car. Its adaptation to the driving style of Leclerc, especially in brake management and curve entrance, is a sample of flexibility and commitment. But there are also signs that the team has begun to incorporate adjustments that are aligned with Hamilton's preferences, creating a technical convergence that can benefit both pilots in the future. Because what Hamilton showed in Silverstone was not a circumstantial performance. It was a warning. A contained demonstration that, when the car accompanies him, his level remains at the height of the best. And that if Ferrari provides the necessary tools, not only will it earn races again, it will put real pressure on McLaren, Mercedes, and Red Bull. What today is a technical promise, tomorrow can be a strategic threat. It just takes Maranello this time. Do not lose course. The Lewis Hamilton classification in the Great Britain Grand Prix should not be interpreted as a lost opportunity or as a simple statistical result in its illustrious career. Actually, it contains a much more powerful narrative, loaded with symbolism and projections for what could be Ferrari's true rebirth. Because what was lived in Silverstone was, essentially, a notice, an advance of what can happen if the pieces of the puzzle begin to fit with surgical precision. The deep reading of Silverstone is that Hamilton is in the prelude to consistently fighting again. The margin that separated him from pole was tiny, and that margin was the product of a punctual weakness in slow curve.